is How the Media Misled Us About Russiagate with Jeff Gerth.
Now you talk about terror.
I'm going to fast forward through his song because I don't want to take over his song during our stream. So
consciences, what shall be reported and for what purpose? Democracy is unworkable. Perhaps no other quote sums up the debacle known as Russiagate, the hundreds, if not thousands, of stories and news reports that falsely painted the Trump administration as a tool of Russia and Vladimir Putin. The flawed reporting is an example of the steep erosion of journalistic ethics and standards, as well as a lack of transparency and honesty on the part of the press. The Trump-Russia reporting has contributed to the steep decline of trust in the media and the bifurcation of the press into antagonistic tribes, neither of which are concerned with the truth, but intent on catering to a particular demographic. The nation's most reputable news organizations, as the investigative reporter Jeff Gerth points out, were guilty of egregious lapses. The New York Times, for example, in January 2018, ignored a publicly available document showing that the FBI's lead investigator didn't think, after 10 months of inquiry into possible Trump-Russia ties, that there was much there. This omission.
So, and that one part right there is what was said that made me go, wait a minute, let me listen to this conversation. Because I don't know if I had heard that and I just forgot, but that was something that caught my eye, that this intelligence officer or investigator found that there was no connection or very minimal connection. And that report was wholly ignored. But he goes into, in the article, it's a long article, so they kind of summarize it in this video, and that's why I'm using a video instead of the article, because the article is really long. But anyway, they kind of answer more of that. So let's let it play a little more. We'll stop it if I need to.
Gerth notes, deserved Times readers. The lie of omission is still a lie, and to put it bluntly, and its eagerness to discredit Trump, the lie of omission, combined with reliance on sources that peddled fictions designed to cater to Trump haters, as well as a failure to seek out those being attacked, dominated the mainstream media landscape for 4 years of the Trump presidency. Hiding behind the wall of anonymous sources, frequently identified as, quote, people or person familiar with, end quote, the Times used it over 1,000 times in stories involving Trump and Russia between October 2016 and the end of the Trump presidency. Any rumor or smear was picked up in the news cycle, with the source essentially unidentified and the information unverified. A routine, Gerth notes, soon took shape in the Trump-Russia saga. First, he writes, a federal agency like the CIA or FBI secretly briefs Congress. Then, Democrats or Republicans selectively leak snippets that bolster their narrative. Finally, the story comes out using vague attribution. The typical reader or viewer is clueless. This erosion has seen trust in the press plummet, with 86% of Americans saying they find press reports biased. The U.S. media has the lowest credibility, 26%, among 46 nations, according to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Stunningly, the decline has been accompanied by a lack of self-criticism and introspection by journalists and press organizations that month after month, year after year, hyped a lie. To date, none of these press outlets, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, MSNBC, CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, and Mother Jones, have provided a post-mortem look at their coverage. Jeff Gerth, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter who worked at the New York Times from 1976 until 2005, spent the last 2 years writing an exhaustive look at the systematic failure of the press during the Trump-Russia story, authoring a 4-part series of 24,000 words that has been published by the Columbia Journalism Review. Joining me to discuss his investigation is Jeff Gerth.
So let me pause and let's, for those that want to get the name of that, it's I forget how many parts it said, but
None of these press outlets, including the Washington Post, the New York Times,
oh,
MSNBC, CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, and Mother Jones, have provided a post-mortem look at their coverage. Jeff Gerth, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter who worked at the New York Times from 1976 until 2005, spent the last 2 years writing an exhaustive look at the systematic failure of the press during the Trump-Russia story, authoring a 4-part series of 20.
this is the part I was trying to find to pause for those that want to take note or look this up. So, Columbia Journal Review, The Press versus the President by Jeff Gerth, January 30th. So, it was written last month, just under a month ago. And that's where he comes in to summarize for this episode. So, let's listen.
24,000 words that has been published by the Columbia Journalism Review. Joining me to discuss his investigation is Jeff Gerth. Jeff, the reports that Trump was in essence a Russian asset, it began with the so-called Steele dossier. This was financed by the Hillary Clinton campaign. Can you explain what this dossier was, and can you explain why it had, long after it had been discredited by the FBI, such an influence in the press?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Chris. The dossier was actually a combination of reports that started in June of 2016 and lasted till a few weeks before the election, although there was actually another one that came out after the election in the fall. And they were compiled by a former MI6 British intelligence agent, Christopher Steele, who had been hired by Fusion GPS, a research firm in Washington, who in turn had been retained by a law firm. It was Perkins and Coie. Mark Elias was the lead lawyer, and he in turn had 2 clients, the Clinton campaign and the DNC, who were paying for this. And as you see by my description, it had a series of layers so that the connection between the ultimate work and the ultimate people who were paying for it was diffuse. As I said, the report started in late June of 2016. And the very first report, all of which were based on human sources. In other words, there weren't any real documents underlying the dossier. It was just a bunch of human sources who turned out to be secondhand, third-hand gossip, etc. And
Yeah, that's what Russiagate is built on. No really hard evidence, just a bunch of human resources. And those human resources were a bunch of he said, she said, and third hand, second hand witnesses. But somehow the media said, hey, regardless of how flimsy and worthless this is, because it's Donald Trump, we're going to go all in, or because it's Russia, we're going to go all in, or what made the media go, hey, we're going to go all in on this flimsy evidence. So I think he does address that in this video. So let's listen.
The dossier became known to reporters in Washington during the campaign, mostly by the summer and then more aggressively by September of 2016. The very first dossier report in June alleged that there had been a conspiracy dating back 5 years between Donald Trump and the Kremlin. It just said it flatly. And it turned out ultimately that the supposed source of that was non-existent and that it had been fabricated, but that was the ultimate.
So now I'm speaking from experience because I was fooled by the Russiagate. The Russiagate thing was the actual last thing before I kind of just made my political pivot. That was the last thing of belief. And my belief went away before like we got to the Mueller report. But I do remember believing some of this stuff like, wow, do believe and this is one of the things when he's saying 5 years ago, this could have been planned five. I remember Rachel Maddow talking about something like this could go back as 5 years ago when he did this, and I think it had something to do with the pageant and all that stuff. So, come to find out, it was all a lie, all made up. No resource for that particular point, as he states in his video. Back to the video.
Sort of penultimate allegation that there was a long-running conspiracy between Trump and the Kremlin. Now, I should say that the way that the press handled the dossier was schizophrenic. And by that, I mean that before the election, the press was, for the most part, cautious and was unable to confirm much of anything in the dossier. And so they really stayed away from it, except for a couple of exceptions. One exception was Michael Isikoff, the chief investigative correspondent at Yahoo, who dropped a report in September of 2016 that was based on the dossier involving a low-level volunteer advisor to the Trump campaign named Carter Page, who did have some contacts in Russia and did business there. And then the second utilization of the dossier came just a few days before the election when David Corn and Mother Jones wrote a piece more broadly about the dossier, not naming Steele, but describing him as a Western intelligence official or former Western intelligence official. I can't remember now. And so before the election, the press didn't bite too much on the dossier, even though people spent a lot of time and money trying to chase it down and see if they could verify it. And I think one of the reasons for the reticence was that the press wasn't taking Trump seriously. As we know, most of the media, as well as most of the country, didn't think he was going to win.
So he's putting out there that, hey, maybe, or he believes, through all my analysis and doing this story, they didn't really bite because it's Trump. Trump's not, Trump's not going to really do anything, so who cares? So not that the Russian interference was important because it was Russian interference regardless. It's Russian interference for Trump, so whatever. That's sort of why he's saying that's sort of why they didn't really take a bite. And then you only saw these two stories kind of broadly talking about it in Mother Jones, and I forget the other, or Yahoo News also put it out there. So, but then he goes into explaining why that changed.
So that, I think that was a strong factor in why people didn't really push it as much as they did after the election. Once Trump was elected, and even before he took office, the dossier then propelled itself front and center into the public conscious and dialogue, starting with the briefing of President-elect Trump on January 6, 2017, at his Trump Tower in New York, where James Comey took him aside and disclosed the existence of the dossier and the most salacious allegation in it. And within a couple of days, the fact of the briefing came out in CNN, and within hours after that, BuzzFeed published the copy of the dossier.
So the briefing when James Comey goes and talks to him, hey, there's this dossier, and here's some of the most salacious stuff that's in it. When news leaked that meeting happened, oh, Russiagate. Then the Russiagate story. Then BuzzFeed, he points out, because I think BuzzFeed is one of the ones that kind of propelled this, where everybody started to pick it up.
See, it had in total all of it, posted it on the internet. So once that happened, the dossier then was front and center in the debate and in the consciousness. And to be honest with you, it is the only document I'm aware of that actually states that Trump conspired with the Kremlin. If you read the FBI documents carefully, including the electronic communication that opened up the investigation at the end of July 2016, it never states that there was a conspiracy. It just says we're looking into possible links between Trump advisors and various Russian.
Never states that. No other investigation, it states that. It only comes in a dossier. The fake bullshit is only there, and that's where all of media runs with. Let's continue.
Officials. So the dossier, whatever you want to think of it, it was the only document in the public domain that specifically alleged that there was a conspiracy, as I said, a 5-year running conspiracy between Trump and the Kremlin.
The FBI discredited it pretty quickly, but that didn't dissuade the press from continuing to use it as an authentic source.
No, but that's because the press wasn't aware that it had been discredited. The press continued, starting with the CNN report in January of 2017 and continuing for many months. The press continued to tout the credibility not only of its author, Christopher Steele, but of the contents of the dossier. Even though within weeks of receiving the dossier, the FBI offered Steele up to $1 million if he could corroberate it. And
he couldn't corroborate
and
it.
He didn't get the money. In fact,
can't
after
corroborate a lie
David Corn
many
piece
times
came out, the FBI figured out within hours that Steele had been the source for his story, and he was terminated as a confidential informant.
You note in the article.
So I spoke over that last part, so let me rewind it so you can hear it without me speaking over it. So I'll go back 23 seconds.
If he could corroborate it, and he couldn't, and he didn't get the money. In fact, after the David Corn piece came out, the FBI figured out within hours that Steele had been the source for his story, and he was terminated as a confidential informant.
You note in the article, ironically, that it was Hillary Clinton, not Trump, who began her campaign facing scrutiny over ties with Russia, and this included a lucrative speech in Moscow by Bill Clinton and Russia-related donations to the Clinton Family Foundation, as well as Russia-friendly initiatives by the Obama administration when she was Secretary of State. In retrospect, I'm wondering if there were greater known ties between Clinton and Moscow than Trump and Moscow.
Well, that's a hard question to quantify with an answer. That there were ties in both camps, if you will. You've stated some of the ties in the Clinton camp. On the Trump side, Trump had done a Miss Universe pageant there, and I think it was 2013. Had made some money, had always wanted but never succeeded in getting some sort of property or hotel or something in Moscow. Clearly, some of his condominiums and properties in the United States were, purchased by Russian oligarchs or people tied to Russia, though they also buy condominiums from almost anybody. Because it's a good way to launder money and not be subject to a lot of scrutiny. So I think it's hard to kind of add up the total on each side and say who had more and who had less. But I think the point of what I wrote about the Clinton thing was that when she announced that she was running for office, actually just around the time that Trump did, there was an internal poll done by her campaign, and they
This is
found
funny
that
right
the
here.
most negative thing in voters' minds was her own Russian ties, mostly stemming from the fact that the Times a couple of weeks earlier had done a collaboration with Peter Schweitzer, who's a conservative author who did a book about the Clinton empire, if you will, and some of the ties to Russia, which,
So at the time of all of this, Clinton had done, and this is Hillary, had done her own sort of internal poll for her campaign and found out that the thing that was the highest thing of disapproval was coming up with her connection to Russia. The irony with this story. Let's listen to a little more of this video. Make sure you go check out the full video over at the Real News Network. But let's listen to a little more before we stop this segment here.
you just mentioned. So it's ironic that when Trump declared and Hillary declared, she was the one in the public eye who had the Russia sort of image hanging over her. And in fact, again, as I point out in the article, in Trump's speech, which was his usual rambling speech when he announced his presidency, he actually mentioned Russia a couple times in a speech in a very aggressive way about how they were a threat and a problem, and that we needed more nuclear weapons to deal with Putin. And not one media picked up on his remarks about Russia, because nobody was paying attention to Trump, certainly in Russia at that point in time.
I want to talk about Fusion GPS. It played a very outsized role in peddling these fictions about Trump and Russia. What was it, and how did it work?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's a research investigative firm based in Washington. I know, and many other journalists know, the two founders, Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch. They both worked at the Wall Street Journal many years ago.
These people are so intertwined.
And their forte, and I would say from my own interactions with them, I'd say this is their strong suit. They're very good at digging up records in the public domain, whether it's court records or business records. And they specialize in that. And there's been quite a bit of confusion in the media, and I point this out in my piece, conflating two different research assignments they had related to Trump. The first research assignment, they've done some political research over the years, sometimes known as opposition research. And the first assignment they got was in the fall of 2015, when the Washington Free Beacon, which is a conservative online media outlet, hired them to dig up some dirt on Trump. And at that point, they did what they are very good at doing. They dug up a lot of business records and financial records and court records, and laid out some of his business dealings in Russia or dealings with Russians, as I mentioned earlier. But that assignment ended in the spring of 2016, when, the Free Beacon, they were anti-Trump, but conservative, that maybe, Cruz or somebody else was their Republican of choice. And once it became clear that Trump was going to be the nominee, their relationship ended. And it was a few weeks later that the Fusion's relationship with Mark Elias and the funding from the DNC and the Hillary campaign was created. And that in turn led Simpson to travel to London. I believe it was in late May of 2016, to meet Steele at Heathrow Airport, where they had lunch. And created the relationship and the arrangement that led to the dossier. And as I point out in my piece, the assignment for Fusion at that point changed. Under the arrangement with the Free Beacon, it had been a document collection operation, something that they're very good at. But then with the retention of Steele, it became a human intelligence gathering operation. And that didn't turn out as well as the document and research operation that they had done earlier.
So there were a series of incidents that were interpreted by the press as signaling or even proving relationships between Trump and Moscow. One of them was the hacking into the Democratic National Committee. This was a purported hack by a Romanian hacker, Guccifer 2.0. And that data was eventually published, the DNC dossier on Clinton. I'm wondering if you can talk about those hacks and the influence they had on the media in pushing this narrative.
I think they played an important role, because remember, again, when the DNC hack was first reported, it would have been, I believe, either late May or June of 2016. And by then, Trump was the clear nominee winner of the primary. And so the media, which initially didn't take him very seriously, now realized that he was to be taken seriously. And therefore, anything that came out was treated as important. And this was an important exhibit, if you will, in the Russia-Trump narrative. And I should point out that while there's been an indictment of a number of Russian officials for the DNC hack, the case never went forward prosecutorial-wise, because the Russians didn't come here to contest that case. And so it remains, an allegation, but it hasn't been proven. But it certainly played an important role in the summer and fall of 2016, and going forward after the Mueller investigation came on board, and they're the ones who produced the indictment involving the DNC hack. And then there's also the John Podesta, who was the chairman of Hillary Clinton's campaign. His emails got hacked into. Again, that would have taken place in the spring of 2016, but they didn't surface until October, in the month before the election.
I think that's a good place to pause it and close out this segment. Maybe we'll do a part 2 for the remaining part there, but go and check this out on your own if you get to it before we do a part 2. It's called How the Media Misled Us on Ukraine. It's on the Real Net News Network.